Afghanistan is recognized today as a permanent epicenter of political tensions and a key cog in the sale and production of narcotics worldwide. However, the problems that place this Central Asian country in the headlines of the media have their roots in the last century. The famous Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in the 80s was seen by the United States as an opportunity, supporting Afghan Islamist groups against the pro-Soviet Afghan government. But this covert operation, sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the millions of deaths that this war generated would have hidden interests beyond the official reasons. In addition to having caused serious consequences in the region, what else was behind this war? How did the conflict between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan and the covert intervention of the United States contribute to creating an international network of jihadism and the sale and production of narcotics? Today we'll learn about a story that still impacts global politics. Afghanistan is located in a region that has historically been the chessboard of the world's great powers. That's why during the Cold War, Afghanistan adopted a policy of active neutrality, which initially allowed it to negotiate with both the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc. However, due to its geographical proximity to both countries, Afghanistan became closer to the Soviet Union. In the 50s, they signed a cooperation treaty that resulted in a millionaire economic loan and a military agreement. The United States tried to dispute control of the country with the Soviets, but it was a lost battle. By the 70s, the Afghan army was armed almost exclusively with Soviet military equipment. Their soldiers were trained in various socialist countries, and the country had become a key piece for the geopolitics of the Soviet Union on the Asian continent. However, all this scenario takes a drastic turn in 1973, when King Zahir Shah is overthrown by his own cousin Mohammad Daoud Khan, who establishes a republic in Afghanistan and dissolves the long-standing monarchy that had ruled the country for centuries. The new government proposes to lead the country towards a so-called democracy, promising a series of political and economic reforms, but in practice, Mohammad Daoud establishes an autocratic regime. And although he initially has the support of the Afghan Communist Party, Daoud distances himself from them and dismisses the Marxist ministers from his government. At the same time, in an attempt to reduce Soviet influence over the country, the new government distances itself from Moscow to strengthen trade relations with the West. The changes introduced in Afghan politics awaken bitter divisions both inside and outside the country. The communists, who initially supported the overthrow of the monarchy, withdraw their support from the Republican government. However, the Afghan communist movement was weakened by various ideological differences that had divided them into different factions. The Soviet Union, which was closely following these events, mediated between both parties to remedy this situation. These efforts resulted in the reunification of the communist movement under the so-called People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. To contain the growth of communism in that country, the Daoud government embarked on a campaign of persecution against all the left in 1978. Amid this whirlwind of violence, a prominent member of the Communist Party is killed by agents of the Afghan state. The leader's death triggers a wave of arrests against other communist leaders in the country. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan responds to the government by executing a coup known as the Zahor Revolution, and the insurrection results in the overthrow and murder of President Daoud. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nur Muhammad Taraki, thus becomes the new president of Afghanistan. To reaffirm its affiliation with the Soviets, the new Afghan Communist government signs a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union that formalizes the Soviet Union's military and economic support for the new communist regime in Afghanistan. Likewise, Taraki's government implements a series of deeply unpopular social and economic reforms, such as land redistribution, the promotion of secular education, and the elimination of religious norms that applied to the women of the region. These policies generate fierce opposition in rural areas, where Islamic traditions remain deeply rooted. In response to the anti-religious measures, the so-called Mujahideen emerge within the country, fighters who, according to Muslim tradition, fight militarily or spiritually for the defense of Islam. These groups will gain greater relevance in the future. In this way, the communist reforms begin to fail and plunge the country into a deep political and economic crisis. Amid questions to the government, old rivalries within the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan resurface. The Marxist factions, recently reconciled by Soviet mediation, begin an internal struggle for power. Hafizullah Amin, a key figure in the party with influence both within and outside the armed forces, leads the opposition against Taraki. It is believed that the Soviets authorized Taraki to eliminate Amin, who at that time represented a threat and generated mistrust towards his political plans. However, Amin anticipates the events and orchestrates a coup d'etat, secretly capturing and executing President Taraki. He subsequently takes control of the country and seeks to approach the United States. Amin's uprising and his desires to align Afghanistan with the West was the last pretext the Soviet Union needed to take matters into their own hands. In December of 1979, the Soviets decide to militarily intervene in Afghanistan, taking cover under the old friendship treaty signed by the deceased former president. Moscow thus mobilizes more than 30,000 Soviet soldiers in various means of transport. Upon arriving in the capital, Kabul, the Russians claim that they were there at the invitation of President Amin and the Communist Party. However, a few days later, President Amin is assassinated. And to replace him, the Soviets choose a president completely close to them to maintain control of the country. However, the decision to militarily intervene in Afghanistan had much more complex reasons than what is officially believed. The Soviets knew that they not only had to get rid of Amin, they also knew that they had detected a dangerous force that threatened to damage the integrity of the Soviet Union, and this threat was just a few kilometers from their borders. This force was the famous Mujahideen. The powerful reaction of these Islamic insurgents against the communist measures of the new government had behind it the sponsorship of Western forces. These jihadist and fundamentalist Islamic groups that rebelled against the Afghan communist government had the direct support of the United States behind them. Months before the Soviet intervention, American President Jimmy Carter had secretly approved the first of many military aids that the North American power would offer to these Islamist guerrillas who opposed the pro-Soviet regime. In this way, the United States believed that by covertly helping the insurgents, they could trigger a Soviet military response in the area and thus lead them into a war with little chance of success. Over the next 10 years, the Central Intelligence Agency would provide the Mujahideen guerrillas with more than $3 billion. These substantial funds would sustain the resistance of the Afghan Islamists for the rest of the war against the pro-Soviet Afghan government. This would end with the Soviet withdrawal by 1989, a withdrawal that some have considered humiliating for the Soviet Empire. This secret Central Intelligence Agency operation with the Afghan Islamists would be known as Operation Cyclone, and its architect was Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter, who eventually deserves another video. The United States covert operation was not limited to providing weapons and equipment to the Mujahideen. From the start, the support included spreading anti-Soviet propaganda, psychological operations, humanitarian aid, and military training. All of this was received by the insurgents through other United States allied countries like Pakistan. With the arrival of Ronald Reagan to power, the Central Intelligence Agency intensified its covert support to the Mujahideen rebels. They provided the subversives with satellite reconnaissance data of Soviet targets. They designed plans for military operations based on satellite intelligence and sent them Soviet communication interceptions. They also supplied them with long-range sniper rifles, wire-guided anti-tank missiles, and many other pieces of equipment that facilitated the Mujahideen's advance on Soviet positions. In the early 80s, the Mujahideen guerrillas were gaining ground against the Soviet occupation and began to create liberated zones within Afghanistan. In the conquered areas, the subversives collected taxes from the peasants who cultivated their lands. But this was not the only means of financing that the Mujahideen developed to sustain their war against the Soviet Union, as we have been telling you. Rather, it was the facade of the true source of funding. While the Western press presented the subversives as freedom fighters, the Mujahideen developed a massive network of drug labs in the conquered areas, and in this way, the production and marketing of different types of opioid substances became a significant, if not the main source of income for the anti-Soviet resistance, but also for those around them. All this operation was done under the approval of the United States and other allied countries like Great Britain. Even the New York Times reports that the vehicles transporting the weapons sent by the Central Intelligence Agency to the Mujahideen returned to Pakistan loaded with opium with the consent of American intelligence officers. The Drug Enforcement Division, known as the Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States, and several journalists who were following the conflict, were also aware that the Mujahideen rebels were deeply involved in the opium trade with the advice and assistance of the Americans, and that this situation could have very negative repercussions not only for the region, but for consumption in the rest of the world, as it was perhaps the region with the highest density of this opioid substance in its lands, as indeed ended up happening. As a result of this operation, Afghan opium production tripled between 1979 and 1982, and like all opioid problems, it quickly transcended the borders of Afghanistan. The production of these opioid narcotics in Afghan territory under the control of the Mujahideen and the Americans had taken over 60% of this drug market in the United States and 80% of opioid narcotics in Europe. And in the neighboring country, Pakistan, the number of addicts to this substance increased from almost zero in 1979 to 1.3 million addicts in 1985, a growth rate so exponential that the UN described it as particularly shocking. Although, of course, the Central Intelligence Agency's relationship with the trade of these narcotics was not publicly admitted at the time, these facts would be recognized and investigated years later by none other than Charles Cogan, none other than the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency's Afghan operation. And according to his own words, the United States had no reason to apologize for the damage and havoc that this narcotic may have caused in the rest of the world for the next years. Of course, there have been scholars who have pointed out or speculated that beyond defeating the Soviets, the real main objective was always to take control of these narcotic fields in Afghanistan and everything that this means at the level of economic interest, population control, and geopolitical interests of the American power. The Soviet Union was determined to postpone the inevitable withdrawal of the Red Army from Afghanistan for many years. Despite their military might, the Soviets failed to subdue the Afghan Islamist resistance and were not prepared to cope with the adversities of the country's geography. The war became a costly, senseless burden for the Soviet Union, and in economic terms, it was an investment with low chances of success. Morally, each day in that hostile climate was a detriment to the pride of the Red Army soldiers in the midst of the weakening of the Soviet Empire. As time passed, the war started to exhaust the Soviet forces and the entire Soviet Union structure, which faced growing internal issues. By the late 80s, the Soviets were convinced that the conflict had no easy way out, and under the direction of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union decided to gradually withdraw from Afghanistan. In this way, the war leaves deep consequences for this country, for the Soviet Union, and especially for the United States. Afghanistan lies in complete devastation. It is estimated that between 1.5 and 2 million Afghans died during the conflict, and around 5 to 6 million were forced to become refugees, mainly in Pakistan and Iran. The country's infrastructure was devastated, villages and cities were destroyed. The traditional economy, mainly based on the irrigation system, was completely razed by the fire of combat, and gradually as the war progressed, Afghanistan replaced its agriculture-based economy with one almost exclusively dedicated to the production and distribution of opioid narcotics. The war, far from ending with the Soviet withdrawal, continues to this day. The various factions that made up the Mujahideen, who had previously fought together against the Soviets, later faced each other in a struggle for control of power. This internal conflict leads to the emergence of the infamous Taliban, also eventually funded by the United States. The flight of the Soviets thus marks the establishment of an unstable government that generates an endless chain of internal confrontations